Women Working in Development event for 2021. It's really, really exciting to have today's session, particularly in celebration of International Women's Day, which took place earlier this week. And yeah, super pleased to have so many people dialed in and hopefully from all over the world as well. I think for me, it's definitely been a top benefit of having to work remotely over the past year that we can get loads of people into the same virtual room at the same time. Before we start, I would just like to say that we are recording the event. We'll share the video to our LinkedIn page, so you should be able to access the recording there. There will also be time for some Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions at all for any of the panelists, please typing them into the Q&A chat box. There's a function at the bottom of the screen, and let us know who you would like to address the question to, so that we can try and get through as many of them as possible before the end. There'll also be a couple of poll questions throughout the session to keep the discussion engaging and interactive. So I'd encourage you to take the time to respond to those as well. They'll only take about a minute each of your time. And finally, if you have any technical issues or concerns, just type them into the chat box and one of my colleagues should be able to help out. So to introduce myself, I'm Emma SAUVANET, and I'm a consultant within the International Projects Group team here at BDO. And I'll be the moderator for today's session, which is on women in cities. I'll start off by giving a little bit of context around the topic for the discussion, and then I'll give each of the panelists the time to introduce themselves before we move into the panel discussion, and then we'll have the last 20 minutes for Q&A. So the focus of today's discussion is on the role of women in urban planning and infrastructure. We're expecting that by 2050, 68% of the world's population will be living in urban spaces. And while cities create economic and social opportunities, they're not always adapted to the needs of everybody who lives in them. So, for example, safety is often perceived very differently by men or by women. And in particular, I'm thinking about the tragic headlines we've had here in the UK over the past week about a woman who went missing while she was walking home here in London. And it just reminds me of the thoughts that we sometimes have as women when we're walking home at night or on poorly lit streets. There are also, a lot of issues around access to buildings and public transportation and making sure that those are adapted to the needs of people who have certain disabilities, for example, or restricted mobility. And I think even if you look beyond kind of physical infrastructure or urban services and start thinking about well-being as well, green spaces and parks are usually located in areas around prime and expensive real estate, which makes them less accessible to the city's poorest. So with all of this in mind, I think it's important to recognize that cities are experienced very differently by the diverse groups of people who live in them. And this diversity also needs to be represented in the design and delivery of our infrastructure and urban services. I mean, the urban development space has historically been male dominated. It's said that every city in the world was designed and built by men. And according to the World Bank, women occupy only 10% of senior jobs within leading architecture firms. So as a result of this, cities tend to work better for the men who've designed them than for many of the women and other marginalized groups, for example, who live within them. So today we'll be exploring the role that women have in decision-making for city planning and the importance of bringing some of these different perspectives into the design of cities to make our spaces more inclusive. We're joined by 4 amazing women who have experience working across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and South America on urban design and infrastructure programs. And we'll be exploring through their experiences some of their unique insights and as well as challenges that they have faced through their work. I'll now hand over to each of them to introduce themselves. So starting with JANKI and then RUMANA, RAFEEF and Natalia.
Thanks, Emma, and hello, everybody. My name is JANKI RAJPURA. I'm a Senior Evaluation Manager at TetraTech International Development Europe. TetraTech has many cities and infrastructure-related programs across our practices, across our economic growth practice, infrastructure practice, and our evaluation and research practice. These programs include sustainable urban economic development in Kenya, Africa Clean Energy, the Nigerian Infrastructure Advisement Facility, and Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility. I work in the evaluation and research practice, and I've managed several rounds of technical reviews for the Ethiopian Investment Advisory Facility. And I also manage the results management and learning contract for the Cities and Infrastructure for Growth programme, which is running in Myanmar, Zambia and Uganda. Prior to this, I worked as a programme manager at the UK FCO in Ethiopia and working on a range of security and justice projects across Ethiopia, Somaliland and Djibouti. Thank you.
Thanks, JANKI. Rumana, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. I grew up in Bangladesh. When I was a little girl, I wanted to be an architect because I could watch people on the other side of the streets living in the slums, an empty piece of land where they just lived there. And then a few years later, the landowner, he built a house for himself and to rent, and those people were gone. So I wondered where they are. And that's why I wanted to be an architect and build skyscrapers. Then when I became an architect, I didn't build skyscraper. Instead, I started working in development. I came to the UK and then I worked internationally, mainly in post-disaster context where I had to rebuild houses and lives and livelihoods after tsunami, earthquakes, and many other disasters. These days, I work independently as a consultant, mainly advising the governments on the broader recovery planning and housing and settlement planning issues as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumana. RAFEEF?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. Thanks, Emma, and thanks to everyone at BDO for organizing this and bringing us into this event where we can meet interesting people. So I'm an urban development specialist with the World Bank. I work mainly in MENA, focusing primarily on Palestine, but I also provide technical cross support to the East Asia region, focusing on Indonesia. While these areas both are kind of vastly different, I'd say city management has the same challenges everywhere. So my background is in urban development and international financial management. I actually did my master's in urban development at UCL with some of the lovely ladies involved in the event today, so it's good to see them again. Prior to joining the World Bank, I worked on a series of development projects funded by USAID, looking at infrastructure and economic growth. So my entire career has been pretty much in international development. I chose about maybe 8 years ago to focus more on the urban sector. And so I'd say my areas of expertise and focus are on metropolitan city management, cross-jurisdictional integrated urban planning, urban regeneration, managing urban growth, and the related municipal infrastructure and service delivery, also with a look at municipal finance and fiscal reform and land administration. So I currently manage or support projects that work in all these areas. In general, I'd say my aim is to kind of help cities address these challenges that they face across the scale. So that means looking at reform and support from both the national level and all the way down to the neighborhood level. I think everyone probably involved in this event today kind of understand that cities can be real drivers of economic growth and provide opportunities for people, but I don't think they know necessarily how to tackle it. And I don't think that the approach of going individually or from certain small entry points is the best way. So my aim is to try and help take a holistic approach to urban development. Thanks.
Thank you, RAFEEF. And I think last but not least, Natalia.
Hi, everyone, Emma and the whole video team. Thank you very much for this invitation. My name is Natalia Silva. I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and I'm one of the co-founding partners of Urbana, an urban planning consultancy, pretty new, almost a year old. In Urbana, myself and my business partner are focused on two main clients, the public sector and the private sector clients, since we both have a broad experience in those very different worlds. And our aim is to try to bridge the gap between the public sector needs and the way the private sector normally addresses urban planning challenges and urban development projects. So currently we have a certain projects with the private sector in urban renewal, in urban development, and also have a couple of ministries the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Defense, where we are trying to help manage all the properties and the way they manage the relationship with communities itself. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation again.
Great, thanks for those introductions, everyone. I think it sets the scene really well, and particularly I'm just really excited to learn more about the diverse experiences that you've all had from all around the world. So I think before we dive into the actual panel discussion, we have a couple of quick poll questions that will pop up onto the screen. So I encourage all of you to answer them just to start get you started thinking about the topic today. I'll just give it a couple of more seconds. I think about 70% have already voted. Great, thank you all for that. Hopefully some food for thought as we get into the conversation. So Natalia, the first question goes over to you. I mean, we've been talking about how there's an overrepresentation of men in the urban planning sector, and how men are often the ones making the decisions about our cities. I think given your experience working as an urban planner for the city of Bogota, and having since set up your own women-led urban consulting firm, what has been your experience of operating in this space as a woman? And are there any unique perspectives or challenges you've been able to kind of bring through your work?
So thank you very much for these important questions. Yes, I mean, I think we all have been experiencing the male-dominated professional life since we began. I must say I'm really lucky that throughout my career, I have had very specific female mentors in my career, and I think that they helped me to like pave the path before me. Specifically, one woman, Nora Aristizabal, who was one of the first leading urban planners in Bogota, actually also in the urban planning department, and she was the one that brought me to this career. After and when we began 5 years ago now, the new projects in the city administration of Bogota, my boss, the urban leader of the department in Bogota, and the mayor Peñalosa himself were very cautious of selecting the best professionals for the team, not only the urban planning team, but the whole cabinet for the city. And it was a very good coincidence that in mostly in the urban planning unit, but also in the cabinet, half of the leaders were women. And also what the Mayor Peñalosa always said was that he was looking for the best professionals, and they ended up being women. And the good thing, or the interesting thing also, was that the big spenders of the budget of the city were women. The treasury leader, the education leader, the infrastructure leader were the biggest amount of budget were allocated, were women, and he was always proud of highlight this situation. So like saying that, I think I'm very lucky to have this like good environment for women to work with. Of course, depending on the situation, depending on the meetings you are holding. For example, the first poll question that you just answered. Of course, I've been the only woman in many meetings, and of course it's challenging to break that barrier of not being the girl in the meeting and being the professional who has something to say. But I must say that throughout my career, and I don't know if that is a coincidence here in Bogota, or if you guys have a different perspective in your own countries, but I think in these 4 years that I've been working for the city, the leaders, the male leaders and the female leaders were professionals, and the best professionals capable of doing the best job. So I think that might be the goal for other cities. I think it's a very good example to replicate. And although Colombia is also a pretty conservative country, and we could imagine that this could be different, I think we're in our generation are also changing a little bit the paradigm of who could be a good professional, who has the best experience to share and to put on the table. And I think again, that might be the goal for urban planners, and of course for the cross-professional paths.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because I know Colombian cities are often held as the model example for urban planning, and Bogota and Medellin were always kind of used as case studies when we were studying urban planning. So, you know, is it a coincidence that there's so many women urban planners in Colombia? So that's quite a nice stat there. But clearly, it sounds like there's still a way to go in getting women in these senior positions in other places in the world. So, JANKI, I know you have experience bringing together and managing teams on infrastructure programs. So do you have some quick thoughts on the role that recruitment plays in ensuring we're creating diverse teams?
Yeah, I do. I think it's really important within our programs, of course, to encourage representation at all levels, especially at leadership and decision-making roles. Otherwise, we really risk making assumptions of needs or misinterpreting data that we've collected. I think I personally have put together kind of short-term teams several times over the years with experience in these areas, and I admit I've really struggled to put together diverse teams and teams that I think are suitably diverse. The key candidates that always tend to come forward in these recruitment drives have always tended to be probably 90+% male, slightly older demographic as well, and from select countries, I would say. I think it's probably a reflection on the kind of traditional recruitment strategies that we might use, that we really need to try and kind of look at these and make sure that we can adapt these to make sure we are reaching more diverse candidates that enable our teams to become more representative.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point around maybe thinking about how we are doing recruitment, because clearly there's loads of very well qualified women and capable women in this space. So it'd be interesting to explore what we can do as a sector to increase that visibility, and just make sure that the women who are already working in the sector are kind of able to get into those more senior decision-making positions. Yeah. So the second question is around, from your perspective, and this is going to you, RAFEEF and RUMANA, what are the most important elements to make our cities more inclusive? And it would be really good to get your perspective, RUMANA, from looking at designing and funding programs through the lens of the World Bank, where you've been working. And then RUMANA, if you can come in and give a little bit about your experience of then delivering these types of programs, and particularly in kind of post-disaster contexts.
Okay, so I guess I can start and then I'll hand it over to RUMANA. I'd say like most cities have inclusive included in their vision statement, or, you know, in their objectives of the city, but they don't really know what it means and how it could look or how to approach it. But I think it's important that the dialogue has started at this point. And I see that this is where our role as women in this space comes to light and is important. I see inclusive cities, really, I see it as ensuring access, access for women, access for youth, access for marginalized communities, people across all incomes. Also access to what? Access to jobs, education, healthcare, opportunities. Basically everything we think, well-functioning cities should provide. So I think it's really important that we need to keep the inclusive dialogue at the forefront and continually discuss and advise and kind of recommend how to best implement the agenda. Basically, it's kind of like, how do we push this approach forward so it's not just a talking point and more translated into practice? And that's where I really think the main challenge lies, how to take it from just what we're saying as inclusive to actually putting it into practice and seeing results on the ground. So we're always looking for examples like these standout cities, that turn things around in 5 years with these, forward-thinking mayors like Peñalosa. But really, actually, the reality is a lot of the places we work, it's very slow. Implementation and reform and these kinds of agendas are slow to put into practice. And oftentimes you don't have a champion. And, your role is to educate the counterpart, what inclusive means, how it could look, what you could, how you can make reforms or little approaches or changes in how the city functions in order to guarantee, or to start beginning to create an inclusive city. And it's hard sometimes, you have to get past the eye rolling and the dismissive comments that you get when you bring this agenda forward, or you mention gender. And so I think I'd like to kind of just share one example of how we've tried to bring it into practice through the projects that we've been doing at the World Bank, specifically in Palestine. So about 2 years ago, my team at the bank, we designed an emergency intervention for Gaza to respond to a severe economic and financial crisis. Basically, the municipalities, the whole area is in a severe crisis. And so the municipalities are running a deficit and struggling just to maintain basic services for people. And then on top of that, unemployment rate in Gaza is about 49%. And in general, women's involvement in the labor force in Palestine is one of the lowest it's definitely one of the lowest in the region and in the world. It's about 19% only. So our project provides grants to municipalities in Gaza to basically maintain local service provision, but through labor intensive municipal development activities. So O&M or infrastructure development, but they're labor intensive. So the aim was twofold: to keep services going and maintain and maybe expand services, while at the same time providing some kind of financial relief, albeit temporary, but still some relief through job creation. So typically these sectors, and in general urban sectors, especially in Gaza, are male dominated, as we've been saying the whole time. And despite all this, we still required a percentage of women employment. And so we had a lot of pushback from the client, and it required a lot of handholding and awareness and understanding for them, because I think much of the pushback came back from also lack of understanding and experience on how to bring women into the labor force in this sector. So what we did with all our, our close supervision and design was to kind of help identify sub-projects where there would be space for women's employment. And so it actually ended up, bringing more women into the labor force, but also bringing women, into the sector and actually into municipalities, literally. So much of the work that women came in with, or the kind of support they provided in service delivery, was actually in back office in the municipalities. So, financial accountants, technical engineers, GIS specialists, archiving, this kind of work. And so it kind of, not only did it provide employment that they needed, but it also gave them a voice in how services are being provided at the municipality. So let me just give one quick example. So solid waste management has always really been dominated by men. And however, we were able through the project to employ women as awareness campaign officers in solid waste management in Gaza. And so it gave them a direct voice to discuss how this service impacts women. And so whether it's addressing their needs or it's not addressing their needs, and how to highlight it and engage the community. So it's just one example, but it's a start. It wasn't even there before. So even though the project faced pushback and really it required a lot of hand holding and awareness raising, now it's fast forward 2 years later, the project is being scaled up to the West Bank, and other donors have come in, and we've really we're looking to replicate it across the region. So now it's being studied, and we're trying to look at the design to see how we can do other similar projects across all of MENA. And so we just had interviews this week with the women who were involved in the project and who were employed, and to see how well it worked and what didn't work, so that we could try and mainstream it and take it forward, and just make sure it's sustainable in this approach. So while it started off for the implementers, I guess, and our partners, they saw it as a box ticking exercise for them. It actually has now, like years later, is leading to really incremental structural change in how you bring in women into the sector. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Rumana.
Yeah, thanks, RAFEEF. Rumana, yeah, it would be really good to get your insights from kind of more of a direct delivery perspective as well.
I had a really fortunate experience when I started working in international development. It was in post-tsunami Indonesia. I was working for a charity who was very vocal about including communities. So in my perspective, inclusivity means getting the voices of the people heard and making sure that their decisions are respected and taken on board by the national government. So first of all, how we worked with the local people and the local government. What happened is that after the tsunami, we were assessing the needs of the communities, and we prioritized few areas where we could work. And it's not only working on rebuilding houses as a product. We worked with people to understand how they want to start their livelihoods and jobs and things like that. And then people were all living in different relocated settlements because the tsunami wiped off a lot of land. And then the national government made a safety measure to make sure that people do not build within the 2 kilometers buffer zone. So as a safety measure and to protect people from getting lives lost in the near future. But that was difficult because there was a lot of land which were already wiped off, and then people wanted to go back. So as an aid agency, we followed the people. We designed different types of housing options so that people can start rebuilding, but they can also relocate themselves if the government can provide them a place to live in the near future, which didn't happen because it was a challenging task. So people could go back, and that process helped us to advocate to the local national government. Together with the local government, we advocated we should support the self-relocation process so that the rebuilding starts faster. And in terms of including the communities, so that empowered the local government and the communities to be able to find land for them to start the process faster rather than waiting for the national government. Then in terms of including the community, who selected a piece of land which was near the original land, which already got washed away by the tsunami, and it was underwater. So the men, when we had a meeting with men, they chose a location which was closer to the original land, original place, which is underwater, because they were thinking about their livelihoods. Most of them were fishermen. And then when we had a separate meeting with the women, they were concerned about the safety aspects, and they were saying that it's too close to the coast, and then there might be future tsunami risks. So they chose a place which is near a high place, so that people can run and take refuge in case there is another tsunami. In the end, we brought them together after the separate meeting, had a consensus meeting, and then the women's decisions were taken on board because it was a more sensible thing to do for protecting the future lives. So that was one of my example of broader inclusion. And also one thing I liked is that it was not just settlement planning. People were also planning how they're going to relocate themselves and how they're going to prepare for future disasters. So they were talking about, yes, in the community, if someone needs help, some elderly person, who is going to carry them up to the mountain. So it was a longer term planning, which we were able to do even after a disaster. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the point about kind of the long-term vision as well, because obviously infrastructure is expensive and it sticks around for a long time. So I think, even looking at our cities in a post-COVID context, like what are we doing upfront to think about our user needs and making sure that we're planning for future shocks, be it natural disasters or pandemics. So really kind of interesting to think about the longer vision and long-term planning when we're looking at cities. So I think we're just going to move up to our final question. And this is one for you, JANKI. I think to wrap up, it would be really good from a monitoring and evaluation perspective to get a sense of what you see as being the key lessons that have been learned from past program delivery, and what we can all do as practitioners, both men and women in this space, to make sure we're better mainstreaming gender and social inclusion when we're delivering and designing infrastructure programs.
Sure, thank you. So I think a key lesson is that it can be really difficult to successfully incorporate gender and social inclusion in a way that's useful and meaningful and isn't just a tick box exercise. And it's probably likely that we can always do better. I think there's many reasons for this, and that includes just the definition of social inclusion. Which marginalised groups are we looking at? How can one programme possibly be tailored to bear in mind all of the groups that would be using the end product? If you consider disability, even within disability, there's a wide spectrum of disabilities, both visible and hidden, to consider. And so much can vary by context within a country, let alone between countries. On top of that, marginalisation factors can shift. So new groups can appear. There may be a conflict that takes place, which results in an influx of refugees into an area, and so more barriers to access. On top of that, best practice has moved on from a do no harm approach to taking an inclusive and ideally transformative approach to try and account for the fact that, you know, a project will be more successful if more people can use these urban structures. I think another lesson is that it's been considered that, you know, it's an upfront investment of resources to be able to incorporate mainstream social inclusion, and the benefits may not be realised within the life of the programme itself. It may be a longer time frame, but over the long run, it should be more cost effective to do this upfront. There can also be a lack of official data on marginalised groups or contradictory data, and it's hard to set the goal if you don't know what you're aiming for or where you were starting from. When looking at gender and inclusion, we need to consider not only the end users and beneficiaries of the project, which I think are the group that we normally would keep in mind, but we also need to consider during the life of the project the workers that are actually involved in the programme. So if there are, for example, women involved, and you're building accommodation for workers, you need to consider separate accommodation for women, sanitation facilities, potentially mother and baby facilities. There are accessibility issues for workers who may have disabilities as well. And on top of workers, you also need to consider local community may be affected during the period of the work itself. And this, I think, can also be taken into account when we were talking about recruitment earlier. So can marginalised groups within the local communities be targeted for recruitment and employment on this project? And also, are there likely to be any adverse effects on marginalised groups within these communities by, for example, bringing in a whole load of other people into the area to work on the programme? I think a participatory approach can be best to identify marginalised groups in these contexts and the barriers that they face. Programmes need to be able to address the barriers that hinder access, participation, and the subsequent benefits of the project or the infrastructure facility. This does require an upfront investment of time, but as I said, over the long term, it should be more cost effective if the end project is more successful. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that we talk about minorities and marginalised groups, but if you think that women are 50%, you know, around 50% of the population, then of men there will be a percentage of men that are disabled and of, you know, face language barriers, accessibility barriers. That's actually the majority of society. So if we're not including these, if we're not considering these groups, then actually the project isn't going to be successful. But as part of this, we also need to consider how to seek out marginalised communities and individuals, given that there may be accessibility or language barriers, they may be less vocal, they may not have internet access, for example. I think it's really important to incorporate gender and social inclusion throughout a programme from the design stage. So having an approach up front. I think it's also important to acknowledge the limitations of your approach, that maybe you can't look at reducing barriers to every single marginalised group, and these are the key ones that have been focused on. Obviously, sufficient budget needs to be allocated for all of this, for incorporating social inclusion in the design of a programme, in implementation, monitoring, evaluation, progress reporting. And I think it's really important from an M&E perspective to include gender and social inclusion markers and indicators in results measurement tools. So indicators should be included from the start so that there are kind of aims and ways and accurate ways of measuring this. Data collected should be disaggregated in a meaningful way that will help demonstrate the positive results of the programme. And I think, for example, we can talk about on the Citizen Infrastructure Growth Programme, we developed a gender and social inclusion ranking tool, which allows the implementing partners to qualify and rank the extent that each of their activities was mainstreaming or is mainstreaming gender and social inclusion. And this also allows them to qualify and rank the activities as well, in terms of the how they are performing in this area. And I think that's a really key thing to be able to demonstrate that you are, you know, at a minimum doing no harm, but ideally your activities are transformative to certain social groups. I think on the other hand, it's also important to mention that there is a trade-off, and you know, there are budget restrictions, and some impacts, as I mentioned, will go way beyond the life of the programme. And so there's a real tension between demonstrating results in the shorter term and justifying the value for money of a programme when the benefits may not be seen for a much longer time period.
Yeah, thanks, JANKI. I think that kind of wraps up the discussion really nicely as well. And your point around participatory planning processes was really key, and I think links in quite well with one of the questions we've had come through from Chloe. So I will direct this to Natalia in the first instance. I think the question is, you know, from your experience, what are the key elements that we need to raise awareness amongst men and women? And how would you then approach the participation of women within the design process? It will be good to hear if you've had any experience of doing that in Colombia, Natalia.
Sure. Thank you, Chloe, for your question. First, I think the best way to raise awareness is with example. And I think we here are raising awareness with this panel, the 5, 6, 7, I don't know, 20, 30 women that are involved in this event are raising awareness every day, and with our example, I think the younger generations will follow up and will have, as I was saying in my first intervention, we are paving the path for these younger generations with our example, and not only for women but also to show men what are we capable of and how we are just, I mean, we are just as capable as they are in the field. And as I was telling you, that was my case, and with the example of specific women, I felt confident. I mean, I just felt that I was capable of doing the same or even more in comparison of these women that I was telling you were mentors in my case. But this is a very personal way of showing or of acting. But if you are from the city perspective, which I think is the following part of the question, I think you do have to share with the communities and to pose to people very specific strategies to open the scenario for different, not only women, but also, for example, as RAFEEF was saying, for youth, for disabled people, for different marginalized people in the community, because for them it's more difficult to raise their hands and to raise their voices. And I have a very good example to share with you. one of the biggest tasks that we have in Bogota's administration was to formulate and to design the new citywide master plan for the next 12 years. And that was a very, very important exercise, not only technical, but also community-led and social participatory process with different communities along the city. And we understood that we needed to have a very, very like big participatory process across all the city's territories and across the different like physical situations of the cities. But then we understood that also different type of communities were in the need to have maybe more closed groups. Women's were one of these groups that we identified, and we started to work side by side in Bogota. We have a secretary of women, so there is only one sector that is focused on participatory processes of women, of violence, emergency for women, and a lot of strategies around women. So we created a strategy and some focus groups with younger women, with elderly women, with different type of women, because also we do not use the city as the same way. Although we are all women, we do have different needs. So we had, if I'm not mistaken, 3 like very big events focused on women, but we had, as I was telling you, the Secretary of Women like with us in all the different participatory processes. So I think to have a special focus on the different marginalized communities that do need to take or to participate in the process is very important. So I think it depends, Chloe, on where you are sitting at the point, like at the specific point. If you are a senior consultant, you do need to share some strategies or some different strategies. But if you are in the national government or in the city government, as I was for 4 years, I think you have the like a bigger responsibility, and you do also have more tools and more scenarios to empower women and to include women in your processes.
Thanks. Thank you, Natalia. I think RAFEEF, it would be helpful to kind of hear your perspective around how we then embed the participatory planning process from a design perspective as well, and what your experience has been around that.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think I just really want to encourage you at whatever stage you are, no matter where you are on the city side, the development partner side, we're a civil society organization, speak up. I mean, I really think that's where our role is. Just speak up, just say it. Like we need to highlight these things. We need to keep talking about it. This is what I keep coming back to, like, keep the agenda at the forefront. And so for example, in one of our projects, when we were designing a land registration project to support reforming the land administration system in Palestine, I mean, we kept bringing the issue of gender forward, and I can't tell you how many times we'd get laughed at or just like smirking, and they're like, oh yeah, the gender agenda, you know, or like, oh yeah, look, we employ women. And I'm like, that's not really what we mean by the gender agenda. What about, we all know women's access to land is one of the, and in turn access to finance and opportunities and tenure security and social security is the lowest across MENA, and it's very low in Palestine. So it's like, we know that there has to be a dialogue. So we kept it going, we persevered. I mean, we wouldn't drop the issue. But one of the also biggest challenges is data. There's lack of information, there's lack of data. And I think this goes back to what JANKI was saying, like we need to use our tools through our project design to kind of improve access to data, improve actually collection of data, but also improve, you know, information and awareness. So for example, like in this project, we made them, or we didn't make them, we advised them. You know how development partners are, like to shift, to adjust the registration process to become more disaggregated, you know, to start recording ownership by male, female. And what did this do? This helps give you data and statistics. So when they're laughing at you, you can say, like, look, women's ownership is extremely low in this region. Why is it so low here? Whereas here it works well. Let's unpack this. Let's understand more. What's working here? Maybe we can, transfer the knowledge. At the same time, in parallel, we also did a social impact assessment. And I'm not saying that it was always easy to push these things through or to recommend them. Sometimes they didn't understand the value of them. But when you get the results, you have things you can discuss. Like, it gives you talking points to go from. So the social impact assessment kind of gave us more information, and it became clear that women don't understand what their rights are. They didn't understand how to access the system. They didn't understand how to engage with the settlement process for systematic land registration in order to ensure their rights. Meanwhile, our counterpart kept saying, well, we reach out, we do awareness campaigns. It came out actually that they weren't really doing well on the awareness campaigns. It wasn't resonating, it wasn't sinking in. And this weakness on their part directly correlated to, lower access of women to land, or to the whole process. It kind of excluded them from the process. And so it's important to try and get as much information as you can. And the more you can get upstream, the better. I know it's not always easy. We are getting information. We're now halfway through the project, but to continue kind of use that as a way to discuss with these naysayers, if you will, and use it to inform project design. And you can recalibrate often your projects. You can, in the bank, we can restructure them. You can do different approaches. So now we're looking to see how we can target awareness campaigns in a way to raise awareness more for women in the rural areas versus in other areas, how we can improve their access. So I'd say first, again, just speak up, try, do what you can, use what tools you have at your disposal. I mean, there's so many different ones out there, and I'm not gonna lie, I didn't know them all. And, sometimes I'm like, oh, why should we do this? And now, like, as you keep using them, you realize that there's different ways that they can help you push things or bring things to light and use them to inform design and outreach. And at the same time, try and get as much information as possible to give you talking points, to have those focus group discussions. Participatory design is not easy, especially in some areas like in MENA, and in some conservative areas, it's not easy to do outreach on mixed, let's say, focus groups or things like that. Sometimes you need to bring in women to do like the surveying, or women to lead the focus group discussions. But you don't always know that. So the more information you can get, the more you can tailor it for a greater impact, I'd say.
Thanks, RAFEEF. And I think the point around kind of land ownership also ties in well with another question we've had from Nadia, which is directed at RUMANA. And the question is, could you talk a little bit about the financing possibilities that are available for communities to access land, essentially?
Yes, thank you. I would like to echo with RAFEEF about participatory planning. I start with that. Because even in the UK, being a developed country, land is the biggest problem. And the participatory planning is really tough because the local communities, they don't want all these new developers and coming and ruining the green countryside. So there is a lot of challenge to be able to make sure everyone's voices are heard and you can decide where to build new houses. But in terms of the responsibility, it's definitely the governments. I'll start with Indonesia's story, which I mentioned already. I went back to see what happened to those communities who self-selected the land. Definitely it was the local government who facilitated the process. Some land were owned by the private owner, some were by the government. So those negotiations were still going on after 5 years. And us being international practitioners, we were not involved. Our agencies left after 1 or 2 years after the tsunami. So those lengthy and bureaucratic processes were still going on, but people could establish their rights and they were able to negotiate with the government, and that was our achievement. But in terms of Bangladesh, like you know, that it's one of the populous countries in the world, and finding a suitable land is a challenge. Even the government can't relocate people in safe locations, and then sometimes people are relocated in coastal cyclone-prone areas, and the next cyclone comes and all those settlements are washed away. So it is a really difficult challenge even for the government. And on a positive note, I will talk about a project by the World Bank, which was financed by the financial grant to the, not grant, loan to the government, the National Housing Authority. So it was for the secondary cities, the new cities which are growing up all over the country, to make sure that we don't get into a problem like big cities we have in London or in Bangladesh or in Indonesia, in Jakarta, or in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. So we started with smaller cities, and the idea was to plan out, map out all the pockets of low-income settlements, all these settlements which are defined as illegal and people should be evicted. So first job we did was we trained the community volunteers to go and do the survey to understand who are these communities. They did the demographic survey, who are the family members, how many members, men, women, elderly, children, education status of the jobs and everything in detail. And then the entire map was done for 22 cities around the country for the last 20 or 30 years. And it was started in a small by the UN and funded by different donors. And then the government became more involved because of the World Bank idea to engage the communities. And in 3 cities, we mapped all these urban settlements which were illegal in the past, but now they're in the city map, they're officially recognized as low-income settlement. They're not titled as informal settlements. And the negotiation of the land ownership process, it's a long-term thing. Maybe we'll spend our entire life working with each of these communities in a case-by-case basis. So primarily it is the government responsibility. And one project which was successfully done was that the government allocated the land where people were already living. And then officially that was given, the land ownership title was given to the community after this long battle. So this is to summarize the process, but we can go on and have another topic regarding land in another webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Rumana. That's helpful. And I think there was a kind of a quick follow-up on whether you have any other examples of kind of a bottom-up self-financing approach when it comes to land ownership. But maybe we can move on to another question. So I'll go into the Q&A because there are a couple of questions there as well. So there's a question from Michelle on to what extent can we connect with youth and children in our programs and as a way of targeting and attracting more women into the profession? And do we agree that there's a need to demonstrate and connect with people at a younger age as women working in these professions? So, I mean, Rumana, I know you do some mentoring work as well. So I don't know if you want to take this one on or kind of open to any of you to kind of respond this one.
I'll be very brief. The project I was talking about in Bangladesh, when we recruited the community volunteers, we made sure that both men and women get the chance, because in the past we had these problems. Of course, you know that it's very praised that Bangladeshi women were in the forefront of all these development projects from the 80s, but that was because in the rural areas, the agencies could go and talk to women anytime. But it's not that really inclusion, because they were easy to be targeted, to be able to talk and to be able to develop all these finance groups. But what we did, we made sure the young boys or young men are also part of this volunteer team so that they can identify all these settlements, they understand the problem of their community so that they can become leaders and take on this process of engaging with the local government as a continuous step to progressing from a community volunteer to a community worker. And in the end, some of them became community leaders and they were applying for councillor positions. But that was those leaders who started in the 80s. But this is the process of engaging. You have to have the bigger vision to be able to make sure that these people are all on board, not just different age group.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rumana. And then I think we'll probably move to the last question. So another one from Nadia. And the question is, adopting a female gaze in planning and development also allows to focus more on the everyday life. So Natalia, it'll be really good from your experience to understand how best should we balance the need for kind of infrastructure at scale and more localized interventions?
Thanks, Nadia, for your question. I hope I understood well the question you raised, but again, I think it depends on where you are sitting, and depending on the budget, on the priorities your city, your community, your intervention site has, because we all know that where we work, we have tons and tons of needs, and you will always have need for infrastructure, need for educational infrastructure, for health infrastructure, for transport infrastructure. And unfortunately, our cities do not have an infinite budget, and you need to prioritize. And for me personally, it was very hard because I was sitting very close to the decision making, and my family, my husband, my friends were like, but why don't you just build roads, and why don't you just keep on building healthcare facilities? And I was like, do you know that we do have a specific budget and that we need to prioritize? Come on, Bogota is a very large city. You must have a lot of money, and we don't, and cities don't. And people think that the public sector, that civil servants are, I don't know, like magicians that can just with a magic wand start to build, and also the decision making process, and the how to say that in English, the beats for like to build new infrastructure take a lot of time, and take a lot of effort and technical expertise. So to come back to the question, I think it depends on the specific needs that you have, and of course a city, a community, a municipality must tackle both situation. Both are really important. Both have very different impacts, and these localized interventions could be more focused on, for instance, the community engagement and how people will end up being more connected with the interventions, for instance, that the city administration is making. And these very local interventions could be more helpful to raise awareness of processes, to bring, as I was mentioning before, the different communities, or the different members of the community into public-led or specific projects. But of course, this very big infrastructure do have a lot of impact. For instance, in public services, I mean, if you are lacking a sewage system or water management interventions in some settlements, of course, this is like needs to be prioritized. So I think it depends on the situation specifically, but you need to balance both scale of interventions, and depending on the specific needs, you will need to hear the community to understand also what do they need, because maybe if you're sitting behind the desk, you will think that your technical needs will should be prioritized, but maybe but in most of the cases, people feel and do have the certainty of the real needs that a specific community have. So I think it's a balance between both.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I think RAFEEF and JANKI just have 2 quick points to add to that, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, so thank you. I think it's a very good question, and there is always that tension between kind of large scale, small scale, long term, short term. I think it's just really important to acknowledge and kind of record the trade-offs that you're taking and making, and also the limitations of your approach, because there is no solution or project that would be suitable for everybody's needs. So I think it's just important to kind of acknowledge the limitations.
Thanks, JANKI.
I'll just quickly add, I mean, Natalia covered so much, and so did JANKI, and she highlighted a really major point. There is a limited budget, and there's always more needs than you have. So prioritization is super important. And I would say that you can't say infrastructure isn't going to fix everything. That's all I kind of the point I want to make. It's not enough. It's not going to be the end all for, you know, your problems, your solutions. It's not just like, okay, put in the pipes, build the roads. I think and that's where scale comes to play. Like, yes, you might need something at a larger scale, but sometimes, you know, to get some economic growth in a certain area and regeneration, you need a more localized approach. So I think you need to look beyond just the building and the infrastructure. And just one last point to make, when considering infrastructure, it's really important to think about what you can do along with it, with the intervention. Like think beyond just the infra and what else you can do for that area, for the communities impacted. It might be a large scale road, or it might be like a bypass road, but it passes through communities, it passes through areas. So you can do interventions in line around the same time that engage the community in a way, you know, that give them access and help, you know, create economic growth in those areas beyond just putting in the roads. And so there's ways that you can link, I think, large scale or infrastructure at a larger scale to the local community as well. And so it's not an easy process. And so I'm just like, and I know we love to say, think outside the box, but just, you know, try. Don't just, you know, put in the road. Thanks.
Yeah.
Emma, can I just raise an extra point that RAFEEF just reminded me?
Sure. Quick one.
Yeah, very quick one. I think everyone needs to take into account or to take the advantage to convert an infrastructure project into a community-led or a citywide project. I don't know if I'm because if you just put the pipes, as RAFEEF was saying, okay, you could solve one specific thing, but if you don't take the advantage of encouraging people to come to this infrastructure design thinking process or participatory process, you are missing a very big opportunity to bring people and to or together, but also to make them know that this infrastructure project is for them and that they need to embrace it, to use it, to take care of it. And we have a very interesting example. Maybe I can share in the group of LinkedIn that I think we all are. The cable car of Ciudad Bolívar, which is the first cable car in Bogota. We did a very big effort to bring people together around this very big infrastructure project, and also connect through public space, through very specific acupuncture projects, different cultural, educational, health facilities, so people could see beyond the infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia. And that would be great if you can share the relevant example on the LinkedIn group. So we've run out of time, so I'll just very, very quickly wrap up. And there's one last poll question. So if any of you have a minute left, please do kind of answer that before you dial off. But just before we pull up the question, I want to say thank you to all of you, our amazing panelists. It's been really, really good to hear and learn from you today. And also thank you for everybody for dialing into the call. And the details to the LinkedIn group are in the chat. So please do join the group, and we'll be posting a video of the recording, as well as an article with summary of the main takeaway points from the discussion. So yeah, I hope to see you at our next event. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you again for the invitation, and a pleasure of sharing this time with you guys. Bye.
Emma, you're muted. There's a poll showing on our screen.
I was just saying thank you again. But yeah, great if people are able to respond to the poll questions. Okay, I think the poll is done. Thank you so much for taking the time today and all of the inputs over the past weeks.